Okay, so we're going to continue on with chapter 22 today. We got quite a bit to go with. Well, not quite a bit. We have a class worth ready to go with chapter 22. But what I mean by quite a bit is we have quite a bit of important information. As I mentioned to you guys in class the other day, this whole course, this whole Bio 2 course, is really different than Bio 1. It's a survey thing, right? We're going to look at different critters. I wish I had some prop. Here we go. Here's a ceramic dog. But anyway, we're going to be looking at different types of organisms. But really, to me, the underlying framework that runs through this entire course till the very last day, or at least the underlying framework that I always reference, is what we actually talk about in chapter 22. We start off with. So it's not like these chapters are separate. When we talk about the diversity of like arthropods, when we talk about how many different species of insects, and arthropods are also, by the way, crustaceans, shrimp, crab, lobster, those are arthropods as well. It's a huge group. When we talk about the diversity of any group, we can't understand how that diversity came about until we understand what Chuck here was telling us, right? Until we understand how through time, remember, that's one of the major stumbling blocks at the time. The world's 6,000 years old. No way this stuff could happen that Charles Darwin was talking about. Remember, he was a naturalist, right? He did what I talked about in one of your learning outcomes. He combined things, chemical, physical, biological. He combined the geology, and he said, all right, so geologists, though, they're telling us that the world's a lot older than that. Okay, so we're going to go through these guys. Remember, you don't know what you know because it's all perception. Aristotle gave us a ladder, and that tied into the perception part because in a ladder, there's nothing in between. Organisms don't mutate. They don't change. According to Aristotle, according to natural theology, organisms don't change. At the time, of course, there is the idea of the young Earth still. The geologists haven't quite gathered enough data to make it into a theory. Okay, remember, hypotheses are tested over and over and over again, and then if they still come out right over and over and over again, that means they're a theory. You remember in Bio 1, nothing's ever really proven. It's just substantiated. 99.999% of the time, the sun will come up tomorrow. Sounds like I'm getting ready to start a song. So even Carlos Linnaeus, who was a scientist, he was the guy that gave us the kingdom of the Filemen and all that stuff. He said, this is a nice, convenient way to lump things together. So when we talk about mammals, we know we're talking about these guys. And when we talk about reptiles, and we're talking about mosses, any of that stuff that we're going to talk about, human beings, we love categories and putting things together. There we go. It's nice for you. But that doesn't, according to Carlos, does not mean that we're related. Doesn't mean they're related. Now, I don't know if Carlos Linnaeus had religious convictions that made him want to go that way, but maybe not. Maybe it had a lot to do with him saying, okay, because remember, Charles Darwin was the symphony conductor with evolution. Folks were already talking about, have there been changes on the planet in organisms through time? So Linnaeus might have been objecting a bit because at the time the geologists weren't convinced the world was really that old, right? So it might not have been a matter of Linnaeus having any problem with the evolution of species the way Darwin finally put together, but maybe he was like, well, not in 6,000 years. And so I haven't read anything about Linnaeus. I'm not sure what his reluctance to this was. But like I said, he didn't it's not kinship, according to him. It's just how it was created. So that kind of is fitting with the Aristotle and natural theology idea. Okay, so we still got this idea that organisms can be lumped together, but that doesn't mean they're related. Now, this slide is a lot more complex than you should be anxious about. We're going to talk about and have actually talked about these folks in this slide, but I wanted to give you a timeline, kind of where we are. I took a really cool course in college one time called the history of science, excuse me. And we it was like a humanities course, and we discussed how, if I've seen farther than others, it's because I have stood on the shoulders of giants. I think that was Newton that said that. How scientists build upon each other, right? How, and I guess this is part of the sadness maybe. Many scientists work their entire lives and never come up with that conclusion part of the scientific method, but they've done enough hypotheses to help the next guy that comes along not have to worry about those and move on to something else and finally come up with the answer. And then sometimes it's really horrible because all this science that gets worked out gets lost. Like, for example, determining longitude. Okay, I know this is not a geography course, but latitude was easy enough to determine on Earth because people figured out this thing with the stars, the angle of the star, like the North Star is directly over your head at the North Pole. It's not over your head here in Florida. Anyway, longitude is much more difficult, much more difficult. And I'm not going to explain to you how it was determined, but it was solved ostensibly, excuse me, in the 19th century. In the 19th century, scientists and folks had figured out a way to do a fairly decent job of determining longitude. It had also been solved by the Arabs thousands of years before. But the information on how to do that, right, was stored in the library at Alexandria. Now, I don't know if you remember, but even as a kid, I remember thinking, because I loved libraries. I loved the way they smell. I always loved as a kid hanging out in libraries. They were quiet. I could get books and just flip through and look at pictures. It was awesome. But the Library of Alexandria, when it was burned in 450 AD or something like that, I can't remember if that's exactly the number, but a lot of information was lost, including a lot of what Arab sailors, astronomers, geometers, mathematicians had figured out. Yeah, makes you wonder what else gets lost or was lost during that time. It's kind of makes you sad if you think about it. Okay, so let's kind of go on to these guys. So we got Hutton, and what's Hutton talk about? He's a geologist, right? And the big thing that Hutton is really focusing on is time. He's saying that this canyon that was formed, this Grand Canyon, was formed by, as you guys understood and told me, it's just water eroding rock. Now, okay, if you put a rock into a bucket of water, Home Depot bucket or something like that, how long would it take until that rock would erode? Give me a ballpark figure. Doesn't have to even be a number. Just a rock. Just throw a rock into a bucket of water. Now, you might have to keep refilling the bucket with water. Yeah, depending on the rock. Maybe sandstone, yeah. Long time or a short time, though? Yeah, could be. What if you threw in a lump of granite, right? A lump of granite would take an awful long time. But it would eventually erode, wouldn't it? Eventually, the water of the Colorado River flowing downstream, eroding away at rock. Now, remember, it's not necessarily just the water. As the water flows downstream, it picks up sediment, so it becomes gritty. So it's like liquid sandpaper. So, that helps, obviously. But nonetheless, it's going to take a while for that river to cut down through that rock. But Hutton said that given enough time, that can happen. It's like eating the elephant analogy I gave you, right? You could consume one bite at a time. The Colorado River could erode a mile deep into rock if it eroded, 1/10 of 1 millimeter per day times a bazillion years. And that really is the key, isn't it? The key is time. No way in 6,000 years. But if, we make an observation, look how far down that river is, look how it's cut through the rock, and we go through the scientific method, the really only conclusion that we can come up with is we have to change our hypothesis of how old the Earth is. Because the Earth has got to be a lot older than 6,000 years to witness what we see. Right? That's what we do in science. We put observations together and come up with a reasonable conclusion. It's the old Abraham Lincoln, what do you call them, parables? Walking down the road, you see a fella clearing some land one day. The next day he's cutting the land, the timber into timbers, into logs. And the next day he's arranging them in a rectangular arrangement. And he's putting windows into this thing. He's building a house, right? That's what happens in science. I look at this, at this river. Now, Hutton didn't see the Grand Canyon, folks, but obviously there are other canyons throughout the world. I don't want you to mislead you there. But you look at how rivers cut through canyons and you say, okay, I can pretty well surmise that this works the same way as if I'm standing at the beach and I can watch the water trickle through the sand. Sand's a lot easier to erode through, but it's just wimpier rock, right? Same idea. Okay, now we're going to come back to geologists, but remember Malthus. Malthus said that there was this battle that goes on, right? That there's this battle between how many there are on the planet and how many resources there are. And early on in time, while there wasn't a lot of resources, we weren't doing agriculture and raising livestock. We were, the hunter-gatherers. But early on, there wasn't a lot of it. So that kind of lifestyle, imagine if you lived your life that way. That'd be kind of neat. Spend a year as a hunter-gatherer. Spend 1 year, in other words, and if you have a problem with dispatching, that's sort of a politically correct way to say killing animals, you could be a vegetarian, but spend a year being nothing but a hunter-gatherer, either eating things, eating things, or eating things you find in the wild. Even if you know a lot about the things you can and cannot eat, and there are some things, there's wild asparagus that grows here in Florida. My cousin was down a couple summers ago, and she's just a couple years younger than me, so she's always been woodsy like I have. So we're out in the woods wandering around, and there's some wild asparagus. Now, she's from Texas, West Texas. So I gave her a piece of it and said, you can eat this. So she gives me this weird look, kind of like the way you guys did with the grapes the other day. Which it was funny because when I got home, I felt this tingling on my lip. I'm like, oh, I hope those were grapes. But anyway, so I gave her the wild asparagus, and I said, you can eat it, Sharon. So she looks at me, eats it. And, of course, it's fine. It is. It's not really bad tasting. And she laughed. She said, it's so funny because that was the same thing. She's about 4 years younger than me. It's the same thing we did as kids. I could talk her into anything. I'm like, come on. Grandma's not going to know if we sneak across the cemetery to go to the store. You know, okay. And she'd go with me. So she said, I'm still doing it. 50 years later, I'm still doing whatever you tell me. All right, so, but down here, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you know, that's rough, but the nice thing is there's not a lot of you, so you might make do. But when we get to this point where there's this big gap, okay, yeah, resources have increased. I know, now we're much better at growing crops, but we're a heck of a lot better at making people. And this happens not only just in humans, by the way, this happens in other organisms. The idea behind this that Malthus is telling us is that populations grow much more quickly. They outstrip, outdistance the ecosystem's ability to support them. The ecosystem, the biotic, the abiotic, the food they must eat, the gases they must have, the liquid they must obtain, right? So all of this gap that you see leads to this struggle for existence. Now, Malthus was a sociologist. Right? So he wasn't talking what Darwin was talking about, and I can't remember who is initially coined struggle for existence. It might have been Malthus. It may have been Darwin after he read Malthus. But nonetheless, the idea behind this is that there's a struggle, right? That means there's a battle. That means there's a competition. And in a competition, in a battle, there's a winner and a loser, right? There could be a tie. Yes, I know that. Ricky Bobby. Can't have two number ones. That'd be 11. But, you know, the idea behind this struggle is that there's going to be haves and have-nots. And there's going to be, if we're talking about a population of humans, those who get enough food and those who don't. If we were talking about, say, populations of reptiles, some species of reptiles need a particular type of environment as a nesting site. In other words, it needs to be the right kind of grass and mud to build a proper nest with the hopes. Now, it's not because they just like the way it looks. There's something about the biology, something about the reproductive success that if you build your nest in this spot, there's a better chance. Okay, but maybe there's only so many of those spots. So the struggle there is finding a nesting site. And if you can't nest, you can't reproduce. And if you can't reproduce, your offspring can't inherit your variability. They can't inherit your genetic information, right? And if you remember from Bio 1, you just touched on it, that's what evolution is all about. Evolution by natural selection is everything is a little different, huh? Not everybody's the same, and that difference might sometimes be the difference between you living and dying, okay? All right, so let's keep going. I think we're back to geology. No, we talked about Lamarck, and Lamarck was the guy that helped us understand that when you look in the fossil record, what you are really seeing is a history book. That as you go deeper in the layers of rock, and we have ways to date the rock, by the way, which I talk about a little bit later on, but the fossils that we find there, if the rock is X amount of years old, then we know the fossils must have been about X amount of years old, give or take a few million. But heck, when you're talking about 500 million, what's a half a million years, right? Well, what Lamarck said, and the significance of his work, was the fact that he understood, didn't know how old they were, but he understood that obviously, watching and understanding what geologists have told us, that when sediment forms, it forms in layers. And of course, this layer's first, the gold one, then the brown one, then the orange one, and then the blue. And that's common sense, right? Who would ever think that the layers form the other way? Okay, so not knowing that what age they are, but knowing that older is deeper and younger is shallower, he can then say, oh, these fossils down here were around during a previous period. These fossils up here were around in a more recent period. And if he can follow what looks like a line of descent, similarities. Now, he's just looking at them. And you're going to find out as we go through our discussion of evolution and selection that, oh man, just the way something looks, that doesn't mean it's related. That doesn't mean it's, okay, everything's related. Doesn't mean it's closely related. Let me give you a quick example of that. Shark and a dolphin. A regular, everyday, run-of-the-mill shark and your bottlenose dolphin. They look a lot alike, don't they? But I would assume most of you know that they're not closely related, right? What is a shark? What's a dolphin? What's the big thing that makes them different from the way they look? Well, they look similar. Sure. Sharks aren't mammals, are they? Right? Exactly. Anyway, so more on that later on. But, you know, if you don't get fooled by something like that, like Lamarck did, he's a smart guy. And again, he's doing this with invertebrates. A lot more difficult because they don't fossilize very well. Oh, no, it's at school. I was going to show you a fossil on the camera, but I have it at school. Remind me. But the whole idea here is if you have these lines of descent, you can follow these similarities in the way organisms look. And yet the ones in the lower strata, in the lower layers of rock are no longer around. I mean, Lamarck's walking around up here. He doesn't find any of these things. He's actually trilobites. I have some of those too. I'll show you guys in class, trilobites. Really, really cool. There are no trilobites around. You find a trilobite, oh my goodness, you better come bring it to me because they're extinct. They've been extinct for 500 million years. But if you look at that trilobite, and we will look at this in class, you might look and say, well, but it kind of looks like an insect, doesn't it? Doesn't it kind of look like some insects that are running around today in a really sort of stretched, you know, broad sense? I think so. Similar shape, segments, right? Maybe it'll help a little bit when we do get in class and you can look at some fossilized trilobites. But if you're thinking, yeah, I'm not trying to lead the witness here, but if you're thinking, yeah, I guess I could see where that could be some type of an insect. Well, trilobites were an arthropod. They weren't insects, but they were the group that eventually insects arose out of. Right? So there you go. Lines of descent. Oh, it's not this, right? This is not how organisms evolve. You can't will yourself to have a longer neck. You cannot will yourself to be increase your chances of your offspring having a longer neck by stretching your neck. You can't will yourself to have offspring that are better. What I say in class, basketball, right? By shooting free throws, right? That's inheritance. I'm gonna type that in there. Inheritance of acquired characteristics. Notice what's important about that. What Lamarck used as a mechanism. Okay, organisms changing through time, evolution. The mechanism. What's the mechanism? It might be, as we talked about in class, right? Folks moving in. The cheetah going through a bottleneck that we'll talk about a little bit later on. The mechanism. This is what Lamarck says was the mechanism for evolution. That organisms acquired characteristics. What's he mean? Well, that little ancestor, the modern day agape, acquired this characteristic of stretching. It's stretched. Okay? Acquired characteristics is to contrast it against inherited. Yeah? Stretching your neck is not an inherited characteristic. I guess maybe the ability to do that, but the stretching your neck because you want to reach up to the brows that's a little bit higher to reduce your competition of all the little rugrats that are running around down here, you know, and heck with that, I'll eat up here, okay? But the desire, the stretching, the reaching of your neck, you see what I'm doing? I don't know if you can see it in the camera, but anyway, that's not what's going to cause these organisms to change. It's inheritance, okay? Yeah. So thank you, Lamarck, for understanding that that the environment had a very strong influence, or environment is the strong influence on evolution by natural selection. Okay, I'm going to try to always keep you in mind that whenever I talk evolution, I'm going to want to make sure I mention natural selection because that's different than evolution. And natural selection is the correct mechanism. That's not the mechanism here. The mechanism here is acquired characteristics. In natural selection, Darwin's theory, which we're going to be moving here in just a couple of slides, it was the inheritance of inheritable characteristics. Okay, if you get my idea, it's heredity. Okay, wasn't a lot of knowledge about genetics back then, how things were inherited. So Lamarck, we give him a pass. Smart guy, right? But just not quite there. Revise that hypothesis, and we move on. All right, but I want to go back to just a couple of more things about geology, because I want you to see that even in geology or geologists or biological geologists, to me that's what paleontologists are. If you want to be a paleontologist, you're going to take a lot of geology courses. You can't understand the critters in the rock layers until you understand the rocks. Okay, so along comes this guy named Georges Cuvier. We consider him the father of paleontology. He was one of the first. When someone's the father, like Darwin's considered the father of evolution, even though lots of people were looking at evolution before him. Lots of people were looking at Lamarck. Lots of people were looking at fossils before Cuvier. He was just the first big name, I guess, if that's what you want to think about. Now, he had an idea to explain why, if we looked in the fossil record, we found those changes Lamarck was talking about. All right, he said, "Oh, okay, let's very good science. Let's submit an alternative hypothesis to this idea that what Lamarck saw when he saw those lines of descent was evolution." Okay, that species in lower layer aren't around anymore, but they gave rise to the species that are in higher layers. You see what I mean? Let's see if there's another alternative hypothesis to that. And again, we have to that's exactly what science is supposed to do. Scientists love nothing more than poking holes in each other's theories. It's not because they're angry folks, some of them are, but it's because that's what we live and die for. That's the discipline we're in. The discipline we're in is to try to find when it's not wrong, because once you eliminate all the wrong, the only thing left is the right, the correct. Okay, so here's Cuvier's theory. He called it catastrophism. Actually, catastrophism is another way you could explain it is anti-uniformitarianism. Good gosh. Anyway, uniformitarianism, which is kind of an extension of Hutton's theory. Remember, was that the river could erode through the rock. Well, uniformitarianism, which is actually what we'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide, but I can bring it into here, says that the speed at which that happens has remained the same on Earth through time. In other words, water in the past did not more quickly erode through rock than it does now. Physics tells us that. It's all governed by physics and friction, which is all stuff you learn in physics. So what Hutton's gradualism and uniformitarianism together were saying was that the speed of these processes has not changed. All right, now, here's what Cuvier is saying. Well, maybe that's not right, so that's why we got the anti-uniformitarianism. And what he says is actually, I wrote it in the italics there, but look, follow the flow chart there. And actually, let's follow. Let's follow in the direction we are. So we get a catastrophic Earth event, asteroid. Now that's happened. We know for a fact the big one 6 times. Smaller asteroids, asteroid folks call the size of asteroids have these very odd monikers for them. Really big ones, like the ones that hit the dinosaurs, are called planet killers. Smaller ones are called the city killers, village killers, that kind of thing. The idea is that's what it could wipe out. So we get this catastrophic Earth event. Doesn't have to be a planet killer. It could be a flood, volcanic eruption, and lava. A little bit later on, at the beginning of this class, but a little bit later on, we'll talk about the fact that at one time in the past, much of the middle of Russia, off in that Siberian area, was a big, huge pool of lava. Right? So that's a catastrophic Earth event. Now, that pool of lava erupted, not erupted, but because it was a lake of lava, it wasn't a volcano. But if it was at the surface and all those noxious gases and blah, blah, blah were coming out, you could get a mass extinction. All right? So, or even let's just say a volcano erupted. Blah, you get all the ash, you get all these critters dying off, plant mass extinction. Okay, mass extinction. Now, through time, things grow back. Mount St. Helens went off in, oh, where's that thing I have? Anyway, my parents were living up there at the time. Mount St. Helens exploded back in 1980, okay, and wiped out critters there, plants and animals alike. But you look at the landscape now, it looks like in many cases, in some cases there's still a lot of damage, but in many cases it looks like nothing ever happened. Stuff has grown back. You know, because once you clear an area of organisms, guess what that area represents? No competition. Now, animals got to wait for the plants to come in, but the plants got no competition, right? They make their own food. Those autotrophs, they have that benefit. They go onto that spot of cooled off lava rock that's beginning to erode, and there ain't nothing there but a few little cracks that you can get your roots into. And as long as there's sun, which there is, going to have another 5 billion years of that, no problem with that, plants can start growing. God, I saw this really cool movie when I was a kid in 8th grade, and it showed this volcano erupting off Iceland. And all this, it was underwater volcano. Eventually it erupted enough stuff that it made an island out of ocean in the middle of nowhere. And within like a year or two, there was stuff already growing on this volcanic island that was used to be just ocean, right? So these critters move in. Now we know that happens. So Cuvier's not wrong on that. Foreign species, you know, immigrate to repopulate. They go a bit, wow, there's nobody home. Run, run, run. The plants get out there. Then the animals go, I'm not going to eat this stuff that everybody's competing for here. Okay, so you giraffes figured out the stuff on the top of the tree. Good for you. I can't do that. So I'm going to go off to this new area and hang out there. Now, that causes changes in local species composition. What we mean by changes in local species competition is then another catastrophic Earth event occurs, kills off them ones that moved in to begin with. They become sedimentized. They become in the sediment, like Lamarck found. And through time, it looks like things have changed, but it's not. It looks like things have evolved, but it's not. It's different critters moving in. Okay? You know, all right. That's a reasonable alternative hypothesis, isn't it? The reason why it's a reasonable alternative hypothesis, folks, is this does happen. Catastrophic Earth events occur, mass extinctions occur, foreign species immigrate to repopulate. If it did not happen, if this was completely false, we wouldn't be here talking about it. The dinosaurs suffered a catastrophic Earth event, which wiped them all out. It was when the mammals were around during the dinosaurs, folks, but they weren't around like us. They were small little critters that only came out at night with big eyes so they could see, but they weren't dominant. When the dinosaurs left, when they went extinct, what was left was this, you know, unencumbered territory here, and species began to radiate out in terms of evolving and becoming diverse, and so did mammals. Okay? So anyway, we have this great alternative hypothesis, you know, great alternative idea that what we're seeing here is not evolution, but just catastrophism. Okay, and is Cuvier wrong? No, he's not wrong. We can find evidence of this. We can find paleontological evidence of organisms in the layers that look like there might be it could be evolution, but it really is everything Cuvier talked about. But it isn't always that way, right? In every situation where you see change through the rock layers, most of the time it's going to be evolutionary change, all right? Because in some cases, the changes occur so quickly that, holy cow there, Cuvier, we're going to have a catastrophic Earth event every weekend. Now, I don't mind an asteroid planet killer every 65 million years, but I got things to do on the weekend. I really don't want to deal with this, right? Well, in terms of the flood mentioned in the Bible, there's at this point no paleontological evidence to document that. I know one of the things that I've read about is that many times folks living in an area, when some catastrophic event occurs, like a flood, then it's viewed as it being flooding the world, because to them that was their world. So there may have been history of floods occurring in that part of the world during that time. But of course, again, you know, if you were living in Pompeii when Vesuvius went off, it wiped out your world, and Vesuvius didn't wipe out the world. So is that what you were referring to, Thomas, about, you know, how does that fit into this whole idea? Yeah, okay. All right, folks, let's move on. What do we got? One more geologist, and I've already mentioned him. What Lyell did, and the reason why I mentioned Lyell is because this is the book that Darwin speaks about having taken on that cruise that he went on. This is the book that he read. He read Charles Lyell's book, and in Charles Lyell's book, he took Hutton's eroding river very slowly, and he said that process of erosion of the river very slowly had been occurring at the same rate through time. Okay, so do the math. How long would it take the Colorado River to chew through a mile of rock? You can calculate out with physics, just like we were talking about, blah, 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 blah. How many years would it take to do that, right? It's simple. It's not even calculus, thank goodness. It's arithmetic. Add A and blah, 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 and you get the number. The Earth, therefore, it's got to be a lot older than 6,000 years. It must be in order. I don't remember what Lyell first said on their first predictions. I don't know how close they were. Not a geologist. But nonetheless, in order of lots of years old, millions or billions of years, right? So that this whole process that's going on Earth, though, of erosion, if you'd say, well, gosh, after a while, then there wouldn't be any mountains. Everything would be eroded. Okay, that's the other part of Charles Lyell's theory, his overall theory, was we go back to the, I used a seesaw in Bio 1 to explain an analogy, so I'm sorry, but we go back to this idea of a seesaw. And a seesaw is up and down and things are balanced, right? So over on the left, we have erosion. So mountains are being eroded into the river, just like the Colorado River is doing. And over on the right, does anybody know what, this is the picture I pulled off the web. Does anybody know what I'm trying to depict on the right? What process is occurring there? The picture's not helping. Think about what is the opposite of erosion. It's not derosion, by the way. Yeah, you see the water part, Jennifer. Yeah, I got you. Ignore the water part. Look more at the little slabs down below. Down below, because let me see what that's doing. It happens on Earth, and it happens quite frequently or prominently on the west coast of the United States. Yeah, it's moving plates. There you go. You got it. So we know that the world is a series of plates, right? That plate tectonics. Wegener's theory. There's these plates that fold on this semi-molten magma underneath. So basically, it's like oh, I just drew a blank. Creme brulee. Yeah, no. You know how the sugar floats on top, but it's these plates that move around on Earth and they crash into each other. And one of the ways when they crash into each other, what happens is they both kind of form a V when they crash into each other. Then they form those really deep trenches, like out in the Pacific. And over here, like on the eastern or west coast of the United States, as plates move against each other, so plates moving this way and moving that way, one might ride over top of the other one. All right, well, how does that build mountains? Well, if we continued this plate pushing over the top, we would eventually create a continent, a mountain, an elevated area. The Matterhorn. Oh, probably couldn't. Yeah, if you look at the Matterhorn, that mountain in Switzerland. Oh, I got to hold on one second, folks, because I was just watching a show the other day about this, and I was just like, oh, I got to remember to talk about that Matterhorn. Let's see a picture. Give me 1 second, folks. I got to put this on. Let me see if I can. If you're online, you can also, really quickly get a picture of the Matterhorn. I just want to. Okay. Sweet. There it is. There's the Matterhorn. The way the Can I draw on this too? Oh, I can. The way the Matterhorn is shaped, the reason why it looks the way it does is these rocks over here come from one continental plate, the European continental plate. Okay, and they're pushing, as the arrow indicates. And this mass of rocks over here is from the African plate, which, of course, we're talking here in Switzerland, but the African plate is part of that huge plate that Africa is found on, including the Mediterranean Sea would be on it as well, is pushing that way. And what you get here is these rocks pushing against each other, and they're folding, and then they're tipping over at the top as this plate continues to push. Yeah, isn't that neat? That is so. What they went and they looked at the rocks. They were able to examine the rocks and go, you can see, and the Matterhorn, I don't know how tall it is, but it's pretty doggone tall. So, you know, you've got direct evidence of this building up. And then, of course, we go back to the other side of the seesaw of snow and rain and wind. What happens to all this stuff? It eventually erodes, doesn't it? Yeah, it eventually erodes. Even the Everest erodes, even though Everest is also climbing too. The thing with Everest is it's the Asian plate. The Asian plate, and then India used to be a separate continent down around the South Pole, and it drifted up through the Indian Ocean and ran into the Indian plate or Asian plate and pushed it, and that's what caused the Himalayas. Plate tectonics is really cool. We'll talk about it a little bit more when we get into class. There we go. All right, so you see what's going on there? We got eroding, we got plate tectonics, so we're building up mountains, we're eroding mountains, and it's all going back and forth. Again, I keep track of my time here because this is a newer time for me, so I sometimes lose track of where I am. So anyway, everybody understands, but the important thing about gradualism, uniformitarianism, Lyell, Hutton, and all these geology folks was, number one, the world's an old place, and number two, the processes that we see, the erosion, the mountain building, occurs at a really, 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 really slow rate. Really slow rate. And it's not been faster in the past, so you can't say, well, maybe erosion was a lot faster in the past, so the Earth is only 6,000 years old. No, unless the laws of physics have changed, and physicists tell us they don't, okay? You know, it's that inductive reasoning. If our planets move around the sun, oh, did you hear about yesterday? I heard on the news that they found a planet near us, very close to us. I think it's the nearest star to our sun, which is Alpha Centauri, isn't it? But anyway, they believe that there may be oceans on it. There may be life. There was all kinds of neat stuff that they were finding out about. Yeah. So anyway, the way the planets in our solar system move around the sun, if you're looking at this planet at Alpha Centauri or whatever it is out there, if that's correct, I wish I knew my astronomy a little bit better. But how would you deduce, using a deductive reasoning, how would you deduce that planet interacts with its sun, its star? Probably the same way, right? In an orbit. Okay, so there's no reason to believe that the physics of eroding rock with a river would change through time either. So again, if we can accept the fact, and it's common sense, that rivers can erode through rock and make a canyon, and we can accept the fact that that's very slow, then we have to accept the fact that the world is very old, right? Many, many years. And that's nice, because what Darwin is talking about, his theory, his ideas as he went around the entire world, his ideas and theories that came together were that species have changed, and that happens quite slowly, relatively quite slowly, although sometimes it's relatively rather fast, to be honest with you, which we'll talk about. But we need a long time if we're going to explain trilobites 500 million years ago with love bugs. Right? Insects that we all know and love here in Florida. Okay, so I threw a couple of little things that Darwin really noted, among other things that he noted. He climbs to the top of the Andes Mountains in South America, up several thousand feet, and he finds marine organism fossils of marine critters. Now, if the Matterhorn discussion I just went through, you can tell me right away how that happened, right? Those marine organisms, fossils of the Andes, how did they get to the top of the mountain there? Now there's the fact that maybe the Earth was entirely flooded. Yeah, probably not that, but there's another explanation. I asked you, how did the Andes Mountains form? Just how do mountains in general, like we were just talking, form? Sure, and they're pushing against each other, right? Yep, exactly. So they're pushing against each other there on the west coast of South America, two plates. It's probably, I don't know what the names of the plates are in this particular region, but as they push, they do just like we saw in the Matterhorn, they form a mountain. Now, before those plates were pushing against each other, they might have been the bottom of the ocean. Yeah, Spencer, that's right. So all those critters we're talking about were hanging out at the bottom of the ocean. They pushed together and formed a mountain range. There's my lovely artwork, right? That's how they got there. And then as those plates continued to push, the mountains got higher, and the fossils were carried with them. Remember, these aren't critters that are around. They're dead, so they got to go where the rocks are. They're in the rocks. That's what paleontology is. Fossils, there's a chemical process that occurs that in fossils, especially in bony fossils, the organisms with bones, the bones are replaced by rock crystals. It actually does become rock. Okay, so then in Chile, the rocks were lifted. Earthquakes let them know that things were moving and changing. Now, we didn't understand plate tectonics back then the way we do now, or even really at all, but earthquakes were indications that there were changes on Earth that could happen. So this kind of fits into that catastrophism idea. But, it lets Darwin know that the Earth is a dynamic place, and it's been dynamic since its beginning. We go back to what Lyell was telling us. Now, we will talk a lot about the Galapagos Islands when we get into the species, the origin of species chapter, but the Galapagos Islands is an archipelago. And I don't remember if we talked archipelago, something. Archipelago is a group of islands, and they're found just off the west coast of South America. And why they're so significant to Darwin is because of his finches, what we call Darwin's finches. Finches are birds. On the island, or the archipelago of the Galapagos archipelago, there are several, 15, 16 different species of finches. And we believe that all those 15, 16 species evolved from one species of finch that made its way from South America across the water to the Galapagos. Now, the reason why that's significant is because that's a relatively far distance that most of the time birds of that size, of that type, wouldn't have made that flight. They might have tried, but they would have dropped dead somewhere out there in the water. It's kind of like the egrets that are here in Florida. Those egrets got to this side of the world in South America. They got to this side of the world from Africa. But anyway, maybe they got a tailwind. Maybe the finches got a tailwind. But some lucky group of finches, could have been one female carrying an egg, by the way, made it out to the island. And then because the islands were close enough to one another, and because of the uniqueness of the Galapagos archipelago, they're also, in many cases, slightly different from one another, slightly different environments. So what happened is that one species of finch, through time, moved out across these islands, adapted to all those little different environments, and we get 15 species, 16 species. It's something that we'll talk about later, but it's worth talking about or noting now. It's called adaptive radiation. Organisms radiate out. One species radiates out to several, and it's because they're adapting, evolution by natural selection. They're adapting to their environment. Remember, never confuse adaptation and evolution as being the same thing. They're not necessarily. Okay, more on the birds later. So let's continue on with Charles Darwin and his ideas. There they are, 13 species of finches. 13 species. I think I read somewhere that 15 though. So it's probably one of those argument things with people who do this kind of stuff, taxonomists. But notice they do different things. There's the woodpecker finch in the upper left, which uses a little tool. That's always fascinating, right? Come on, critters using tools. I don't know if you've seen the old video or the pictures of the chimpanzee who figures out how to get the bananas from a hook that's suspended over his head in the room. Cognitive thinking. Yeah, I know, see? I think your book says 1 to 13. The picture there says 14. I think I said somewhere 15. But that monkey actually, in the room with the monkey, there's a bunch of boxes of different sizes, wooden boxes. The monkey eventually learns to stack the boxes on top of each other to get to the bananas. So when critters do that, organisms do that, we all get fascinated by it. And woodpecker finch using a tool to get out probably grubs that stick to the stick. large ground finches, cactus finches, anyway, a number of different finches that we'll talk about more, but they do different things. Like, for example, there are cactus-eating finches and insect-eating finches and seed-eating finches. And in order to feed on those different things, you're going to have one thing you're going to have is different beaks, right? If you eat big seeds, you're going to have a big, strong beak. If you eat little seeds, you might get away with a much smaller, more diminutive beak, right? And that's just beaks. Okay. All right, here he is. So Charles Darwin came up with this idea after his theory. Look, he says, I think. Isn't that cool? This is from his notebook. What he's drawing out is the people call the tree of life, the bush of life, the web of life. Darwin was saying that species that are around today, extant, opposite of extinct, are descended from ancestral. So he's confirming what Lamarck said. Lamarck said that he thought they were lines of descent. Okay, and of course we had the alternative theories that we talked about, but Darwin came along, and once again, you never prove anything, but what he was doing is he wasn't refuting Lamarck's idea of descent, he was supporting. Remember, in science, we support or refute. We don't prove or disprove. Even if you see those words sometimes used, you know, it's used in the looser sense, okay? It's really not the exact proper. But the mechanism, that's the key. What's the mechanism? It's not inheritance of acquired characteristics. It's not stretching your neck. So after he read Malthus's thesis, his book, that whole idea of the struggle for existence, he went, oh, okay, I get it. It's a struggle for existence. In other words, what we mean again is it's a competition. Some species will do better than others. And what we mean by better is, you know, you can't just say, well, they'll run faster, or they'll fly farther, or they're better at digesting a particular food stuff. That's not what we mean. In this case, we're specifically saying the better means they leave behind more offspring. If you're healthier, if you live longer, if you outcompete others in your group, if you can get away from predators better or acquire prey better, it means you're healthier. Healthier means you can reproduce more and reproduce longer. And of course, you remember from Bio 1, I know you do, that when you reproduce, right, you pass on genetic information to your offspring. Now, if in your genes is some genetic information on how to really run fast, you know, if you're Michael Phelps of the swimming critters out there, and that's genetic, you know, Michael Phelps has got that feet that bend. Here's his leg. His feet can actually bend further back than the rest of us can. And probably there's several other genetic mechanism or characteristics he's got. But if you have that genetically, it's not just stretching of your neck, okay? But if you have that genetically, you can pass that on. And that means you can influence the next generation because you're passing on more of your offspring because you're have that better genetic information. And of course, your offspring, many of them are inheriting that genetic information. Right? It really is relatively simple when you think about it in the overall scheme. Now, it was controversial. It's controversial today. It was definitely controversial back in 1837. It was definitely controversial when he published The Origin of Species in 1859. All right, but one of the things that helps scientists feel confident in their findings is unsolicited confirmation. Okay, unsolicited confirmation. Let me show you what I mean by that. Alfred Wallace, I mentioned him briefly when we were looking at that timeline. Alfred Wallace lived over in the Malay Archipelago in Malaysia. Alfred Wallace was actually most well known for coming up with this science of biogeography. Biogeography is basically the science by which you understand why critters live where they do. Okay, it's not as easy to say, well, what did he look at? Fish live in water? No. Why do these particular fish live in this type of water? Why do these particular trees live in this kind of climate? Okay, but so a lot of evolution, a lot of adaptation in there, huh? So in 1858, Alfred Wallace writes a letter to Charles Darwin, and this is what I mean by unsolicited confirmation. Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace don't know each other. Alfred Wallace hears about Charles Darwin is working on this work and is thinking about presenting this paper to the Royal Society of London. If I remember correctly, that's what you did. You went in front of scientists, and if the Royal Society of London is anything like what I've seen about the House of Commons in England, it must have been a lot of fun, because if you ever watched the way the British do government, they're yelling and screaming and all this kind of stuff at each other. It's actually kind of interesting. But if the Royal Society of London was that way, I'm thinking it was kind of the same thing. So Chuck's want to make sure all his ducks are in a row before he goes there, you know? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Scientists aren't necessarily nice to each other. This letter arrives to him in June of 1858, and in a nutshell, Alfred Wallace describes his idea of the mechanism behind evolution, right? Evolution, as everybody knows about, and it was identical to Darwin's. Identical. Now, either these guys copied off each other. Charles Darwin was living in England, by the way, at the time. Wallace was living in the Malay archipelago, right? So the chances that those two individuals ever met are pretty slim, okay? And the fact that you guys could have both come up with the same wrong theory over something as complex as this, or actually something as simple as this, is pretty slim. You know, if you're in a math class and you're doing a problem, and maybe it's one of those math classes where the answers for the problems are in the back of the book. I don't even know if they do that anymore. Well, yeah. Well, no. Natural selection wasn't a theory, Carson. Yet. It was Darwin's theory. It had been discussed and talked about, but it had not been, let's say, officially rolled out, if you will. It's not officially rolled. Your publication, your work in science is not official until you submit it to a peer-reviewed journal, like the American Society of Mammalogists have a peer-reviewed journal, and a bunch of scientists try to poke holes in it, and if they don't find enough holes in it, they publish it. So that's the rolling out. You can also do that orally, like in front of talks, but back then, going in front of the Royal Society of London was rolling out your theory. See what I mean? So natural selection wasn't well, it was a theory. It wasn't a known theory back then. It wasn't a prominent theory. Gotcha. Thanks. I'm glad you guys asked those questions, because that's very important that you understand this whole idea of theory. So, when folks give you this idea of, well, it's only a theory, you know that, well, no. Theories are more than just, wild guesses. Theories have some basis to them. So, Wallace writes to him basically the same theory, or exactly the same theory. And Darwin's like, like I said, what are the odds that you both got the same wrong answer? So you look in the back of that math book, and the answer, is the same as what you got. And then you call your friend up and you say, hey, did you do problem 5? Yeah. What'd you get for the answer? I got that. Same one I did. What are the odds you both did the wrong work, and the odds that the answer in the back of the book came out with the same wrong answer you did? Right? Come on. Makes sense. You're walking down the street and the guy's clearing land, right? Another thing that really helped Darwin, and we're all very familiar with this, and this is why I say the theory isn't all that difficult to understand, is Darwin lived in an era in which artificial selection was quite prominent, mostly in livestock. If you think about it, if you were a dairy farmer, you would mostly breed the female cows that gave you the most milk. You might expect at least some of their offspring would give you a lot of milk. And then, of course, that moved into agriculture as well. When we talk about, I don't remember which chapter it is actually now, but what we eat today, or what we today call wheat, was actually a wild grass that had been cultivated and artificially selected. Artificial selection is just exactly what you might think it sounds like. Something humans select them. They say, we're going to take, if you have an AKC registered dog, and you want to have offspring that you want to sell as AKC registered dogs, you have to pick, you can't just pick any male mutt down the road. You have to have another dog of the same breed, AKC. You don't understand what I'm saying, right? But you're doing the selecting. It's artificial selection. Now, this is different than Darwin's natural selection. Artificial selection is easy to understand. You want to make cabbage. So you take this wild mustard and you select for it. Right? And you select for it, and through many, many generations, you get cabbage and broccoli and Brussels sprouts. Yeah, that's what they're saying. right? And what you do is you select different parts. Like maybe you take the leaves of the wild mustard and you select until you get kale. And then maybe you take the side of the axillary buds that come off the side of the stem, or the bud that comes off the tip. Asparagus, the wild asparagus I was just telling you about with my cousin, the part that you eat, the part that I gave to her, was the apical tip. That's where asparagus grows, on the tip. Okay, so you select for the flowers, you select for the stems, but yeah, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, I'm going to breed these wild mustards until I eventually get to the point where I breed out all these other things and just have the leaves. Right? Agriculture, folks, it's still done today. Now, here's the problem for Darwin. This has a selector. And this kind of goes back to natural theology. A blind watchmaker, stumbled over my tongue. A design must have a designer, right? The blind watchmaker thing. So these things have a designer. Easy enough to understand. How did kale come about, or Brussels sprouts, or broccoli? Because humans selected. How did domesticated dogs come about? You know, dogs are domesticated wolves. We began domesticating wolves 10, 15,000 years ago. And now you look, we got things like Cocker Spaniels and German Shepherds and Doberman Pinschers, and some of them look a little like a wolf and some look none like a wolf. We've done that in just a short period of time. We've also bred domestication into them. I don't want to live in a house where I'm afraid the animal might eat me. So we're going to select those wolves that are more agreeable to being around us. Okay, see how that works? That's artificial selection. That can't work in the natural world, though. There isn't a natural selector out there going around. So even though he said his mechanism was natural selection, this is the title of his book, by the way. Nothing was short and easy back then, was it? On the origin of species by means of natural selection. There's the mechanism part. The origin of species would be like the evolution part. Or, and this is actually very illustrating preservation of favored races. Now, races is actually species in the context back then in the struggle for life. Okay. Now, what Darwin's natural selection mechanism does is it explains how life is so different. It also explains how life is the same. So it explains what we call this unity. Biologists always love to talk about this. The unity and diversity of life. Everything on Earth is the same. We all share DNA. We all do the basic genetics the same way. And yet there are blah, blah, bazillion different species out there, right? Natural selection also explains, and again, I harp on this, adaptation, right? Organisms matching their environment, become efficient in their environment. Remember, evolution is just change. Adaptation is evolutionary change that makes you, quote unquote, better, more fit. And let's introduce that word because we're going to use it a lot. We're not going to say better, stronger, or anything like that. We're going to say more fit. And more fit doesn't mean stronger. More fit means more reproduction. More fit equals more reproduction. More reproduction equals more offspring. More offspring, I'm not going to keep typing. More offspring means more your genetic information, right? So that's all fitting together now. Not quite as difficult as maybe you thought at the beginning. For example, right here, look at this. This is Darwin. Darwin didn't initially talk about necessarily as evolution by natural selection. He actually called it descent with modification. So he didn't use the word evolution. And I think the reason why he didn't use evolution is he didn't want to get people sidetracked on the other things that can cause changes. But he called it descent with modification. And descent with modification is exactly what it says. It says that through time, organisms, right? So this chart here, you see we're going through time. We're talking in this particular case about groups of elephants. So along the bottom we have, you know, from present day to, was it 80 or so million years ago? And this is very easy. It's like a family chart. This is an ancestor. And then some event occurred that caused a branch to break off. and that branch broke off, and we end up with, through time, these different kinds of elephant critters. Now, most of them are extinct. How do I know they're extinct? Is because their line ends, right? Thank you, pen. There we go. Moratherium, the line ends before the present day. This is the present day. So the line ends in Moratherium at something about, what is it, 28, 30 million years ago? They went extinct, okay? So what do we have left today? We have the Asian elephant, the African elephant, actually 2 species of African elephants, and if I remember correctly, I think there may be even a couple of more. There may be even a couple more species of elephants, okay? So through time, these things have diversified. They've descended with modification. I think they're true species, though, Thomas. Yeah, in some cases. But yeah, there are even subspecies, too. And a subspecies sometimes is called like a race would be a subspecies. Now, what's interesting about this, hyraxes, we'll talk about hyraxes when we get into the mammal part. But look where manatees are. People always say manatees, their closest relative is an elephant. It has a lot to do with the way their teeth look, actually. And notice, remember, manatees and elephants both have that real flexible snout. You know, elephants, it just happens to be a lot longer. And yes, you are technically correct when you say manatees are closely related to elephants. They're more close than anything else. But look, manatees and elephants shared a common ancestor right there, where I put that dot. So way back, almost 80 million years ago. Now, the modification part, that's adaptation, right? Yeah. South America. I believe hyraxes are South America. Okay, so they're modified to adapt to their environment. Now, let's kind of put this into a big context. These organisms are descending through time. Now, you know, it's groups of organisms, obviously. They're being modified. They're being modified by the environment. The environment is then obviously changing through time, and it is. That's what the geologist told us. You see what I mean now? You see how it's important how we put those disciplines together? The geologists not only told us the world was old, they said it's very different now than it was back then. Organisms, we interact with our environment. Even Lamarck knew that with his stretching neck guys. Okay, organisms in the environment. The environment stays the same, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If the environment stays the same, nobody's going to evolve. Nobody's going to change. Nobody needs to adapt. They're already adapted. If you're alive, you are ergo adapted. But if the environment changes, that's when things become different, okay? All right, so we just got about another 10 more minutes. I'm going to go through. I may not finish all of it today. I will never rush through the end of slides. I always have a little bit of fudge time built into my calendar, so I don't worry about any of that. But this slide here, I think, does a good job, and I would definitely become very comfortable with this slide. And not the words. Anybody can memorize the concepts, all right? These are Darwin's principles of evolution through natural selection. So evolution and the mechanism of natural selection. 4 basic ideas. We us critters, us living things, can make more offspring that can possibly hope to survive. All species have great potential fertility. When I worked on the eel in grad school, female eels during breeding season, we counted, would spawn about 250,000 eggs. 250,000 eggs they would spawn. Most of those eggs become food. I told you the statistics with the sea turtle, 1 in 1,000 eggs. Now, when we talk about survival, I'm not talking about the egg hatches and a little mini eel lives for a while. I'm talking about the critter lives long enough to reproduce itself, right? Because if you don't reproduce yourself, then your genetic information stops with you and this whole thing falls apart. So theoretically, populations can grow indefinitely, but they don't. They remain relatively stable. So something's keeping the population size in check. Part B might give us the answer. There's only so much to go around, right? This is the Malthus thing. Resources are limited. Food, water, nesting sites, sunlight, mates, whatever you want to say. Those are limited. And so there's a struggle. Now, if there's a struggle, there's a competition. And in a competition, some win, some lose. And there's somebody every place in between. So in order to have some winning and some losing, the members of the competition have to be different. If everybody in the Olympics ran the 200 meter at exactly the same pace that Usain Bolt did, I was going to say nobody would get the gold medal, but I guess they'd all get the gold medal. But there's no difference there. And if there's no difference there, nobody wins. You know, it's not like when you're in third grade and they say, well, everybody gets a medal. No, and that doesn't work that way in natural selection and evolution. That means the organisms, the differences they have make some more fit. That word I used again. So C says there's got to be differences. There's got to be variations. And there is. Look around you. You know, we look at squirrels. Maybe they don't look like they're different to us, but squirrels they are. And if you're a squirrel biologist, I'll tell you they'd look different. And some of those variations, maybe one, maybe a few. Oftentimes you don't get one, but some of them are advantageous. And what we mean by advantageous is whatever that resource is in the environment, you get access to it more efficiently than everybody else. Therefore, your advantageous variation is you're stronger, you live longer, the girls love you more, and you reproduce. And you reproduce more, and you make more offspring. And luckily, those variations that allowed you to get all the girls or to get all the boys are inheritable. Because if they weren't, they would die with you. Now, look at this phrase down below in gray. I think it's kind of a neat little set of words. It's differential reproductivity versus differential mortality. Very important that you understand. It seems subtle. Mother Nature is not the grim reaper when it comes to natural selection. She doesn't weed out the weak, okay? She doesn't move into a population and differentially kill, mortality, those that aren't fit. That's not the way it works. Natural selection works by a process known as differential reproductivity. Differential means that there are differences, and reproductivity means in the reproductive rate. It's what I've been saying. If you have that advantageous variation, you reproduce more. I didn't say if you don't have the advantageous variation, you don't reproduce. See what I'm saying? It's numbers. The difference is the numbers, differential reproductivity. With an advantageous variation, you leave behind more offspring. So even those that are maybe less fit, they might be reproducing too. But if you lay, I don't know, 100 eggs a season, and you live 10 seasons, you've made 1,000 eggs. If you leave behind 200 eggs a season, living 10 seasons, you left behind 2,000 eggs, haven't you? It's just numbers, isn't it? The longer you live, the more offspring you produce. All of those things together factor into you having a higher reproductive rate, differential reproductivity. Ooh, I got one more slide, and then I'll be done for the day, all right? One more slide, so stick with me because I want to go full circle, and this is a great place to stop because the next slide goes back to Lamarck's question about the giraffes, and it looks at it with a different mechanism. Giraffes have longer necks. We can follow in the fossil record that long neck evolved from a short-necked ancestor of the giraffe and the okapi. When gappies are still around today, like I said, look like miniature giraffes. The top is Lamarck. Stretching, 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 acquired characteristics. That makes my offspring with longer necks. Let's see what Darwin's theory says. Down below is natural selection. I love this slide. Here we are. A bunch of giraffes are born. Some have long necks, some have short necks. I was going to say some have no necks, but they do, right? Some are longer necks, some are shorter necks. Now, in this particular scenario here, you don't need to be a brilliant evolutionary scientist to understand that the guy in the middle probably has an advantage. Even if these guys can browse on that stuff below, he can browse on the stuff below and the stuff above their head. Ergo, he's going to get more food. He's going to not only get more food, he's going to be stronger, more fit. The girls are going to like him more, so he's going to reproduce more. And guess why he's got a longer neck? It's genetic. It's genetic why he has a longer neck. If it weren't genetic, then it wouldn't work. It has to be a genetic trait. He just happened to inherit enough long neck alleles, if you remember that word from Bio 1, which I'm hoping you do. Remember a lot of traits in biology are polygenic. Many genes controlling one trait. Long neck is the trait, so maybe he just, my dad was 6'2", my mom was about 5 foot, I'm 5'7". Okay, so I got sort of a mixture of that genetic information. My son is tall like his father, or his grandfather, like his grandfather. You see how that works, right? You remember from Bio 1. So the longer necked giraffe produces more offspring. Many of them, maybe not all, like me, I wasn't tall, but maybe not all, but some of them are going to have longer necks. They're the ones that are going to be able to reach even higher and higher and eventually get to the point where you have these long necked giraffes. Differential reproductivity. The short-necked giraffes don't die off any faster necessarily. Okay, they might live as long as a long-necked giraffe, but long-necked giraffes maybe get to reproduce more. However you factor it all in. Whew. Any questions on any of that, folks? Sweet. I'm going to stop the recording.